I'm Elizabeth Moger, the keeper of the records at the Haviland Records Room, the archives of New York Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends. And I've been asked to talk about Flushing, the oldest meeting house in our yearly meeting, dates from 1694. Friends had been meeting prior to that in the home of John Bown, which was built in 1661. John Bown had married Hannah Feek and had offered his new house as a meeting place for friends. This, of course, got him into trouble with Governor Stuyvesant. Religious freedom had been granted to the town of Flushing in its patent in 1645, but in spite of this, Stuyvesant arrested Bown in 1662 for harboring Quakers. Bown quietly submitted to the arrest, but his passive resistance could not be overcome. So Stuyvesant ordered him to be banished as an example. He sent him to the Netherlands, stopping off in England on the way, and there seems some reason to suppose that Stuyvesant hoped he'd jump ship and make things more convenient for him, but he didn't. He went on to the Netherlands, and there he presented his case to the officials of the West India Company, which governed New Amsterdam. They upheld Bown and instructed Stuyvesant to allow everyone to have his own belief. And this appears to have been the first successful fight in America for freedom in religion. The Flushing Remonstrance is really part of our prehistory because it dates from 1657. The earliest Quaker missionaries had come to New Amsterdam in that year, and Stuyvesant had ordered that they should not receive or entertain any of these people called Quakers because they are supposed to be by some seducers of the people. These men, who were not themselves friends, though some of them became friends later, many of them were the ancestors of Friends. For our part, we cannot condemn them in this case, neither can we stretch out our hands against them to punish, banish, or persecute them, for out of Christ God is a consuming fire, and it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. At a meeting at the house of John Bown, the 3rd of the 9th month, 1693, it was agreed that John Bown and John Farrington take care to employ workmen to get in timber that they shall see needed for the fitting of the house for raising against the next first month. The first meeting that is recorded as being held in the meeting house was on the 4th of 8th month in 1694 at a quarterly meeting held at Friends Meeting House in Flushing on that date.
Hi, I'm Cheshire Frazier. I'm a member of Flushing Monthly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, which is to say I belong to the local Quaker congregation, which is here in Flushing in Queens, which is part of New York City. I'm sitting in the meeting house, which was built in 1694. We've been worshiping here every Sunday ever since. We were a presence in Flushing, though, even earlier than that. We go right back to the 1650s when this was still Vlissingen, part of New Amsterdam, under the control of the Dutch West Indies Company. In those days, what is now a busy downtown area was virgin woods, small farms, tiny villages, settled by Native Americans and European settlers. 8 years after the Dutch West India Company said Quakers could worship in Flushing, George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, came to preach here. So many hundreds gathered that instead of meeting in the Bown House, they had to gather under a cluster of oak trees, which were forever after known as Fox Oaks. They were a major landmark, so when they finally came down in the course of time, a large boulder was placed on the spot to mark where Fox Oaks had stood. At the time the building went up, there was no Northern Boulevard or Broadway or 25A or whatever you want to call the main highway that runs through what is now downtown Flushing. In point of fact, the building was in the middle of virgin woods with some small farms nearby and a very small village. And what most people see now when they approach the building from Northern Boulevard is in fact the back of it. The front of it is hidden. The front of the building has a very nice covered porch, and it faces what is one of the oldest graveyards in Queens. No tombstone in the cemetery at the Flushing Meeting House dates from before the 1830s, because earlier Friends believed that marking graves was a vanity. What mattered was the evidence of the light in the life of the person. However, when you look at the tombstones, names familiar and important in the history of the county will be seen, such as Willett, Lawrence, Bound, Bell, and others. As you look around, you will see that the building in the Quaker fashion is absolutely plain. The first time I ever walked in here, it actually put me in mind of Japanese architecture. The plain wood, the white walls, the complete lack of adornment. Because Quakers worship out of silence, trying to center down, to get in touch with that of God within them and beyond, it's important to have nothing to take the attention away. And so the simplicity and absolute purity of design, which to our eyes is so beautiful, actually has a spiritual function. Nothing should get between us and the divine. The interesting thing about the structure is that there was no fireplace, no stove, and the archaeological evidence indicates that there was what was called a fire pit in the middle of the meeting room where an open fire could be built. There's some question, though, about whether it was really used, even though it's one of those fond legends that we have. In 1760, Friends, getting a little concerned about the weather, gave in and bought a couple of Franklin-style stoves, one of which is still present and can be seen in the building. This is the meeting house chimney, which you didn't see on the ground floor. The old stoves have the pipes going up into this chimney, which begins here on the second floor. This is where the masonry begins, and then in normal fashion the chimney extends through the roof for the smoke and the soot to come out above the rooftop. In the 1950s, a modern heating system was put in because the Franklin stoves just were not good enough for 20th century Friends. Because of the landmark status of the building, the heating ducts had to be put on right up against the ceiling, as you can see, and since heat rises, you can imagine the efficiency of this system during the cold winter months. During the Revolutionary War, when New York was occupied by the British, their troops took over the meeting house, and they used it first as a hospital, and then as a storehouse, and finally as a stable. They're supposed to have burnt up for firewood all the original benches, and the legend is that the cleft marks in that pillar was made by a British soldier using a hatchet to cut the pillar down to use as firewood also. Happily, his hand was stayed by an officer who recognized that the building would come down on top of them if the pillar came down too. The benches that you can see in the meeting room now were made after the Revolutionary War because the old benches had been burnt up. They were all made by hand, and so they are not identical. Each one is a little bit different. They're characterized particularly by these nice curves for you to sit comfortably and lean on. It's in this century that cushions were put down, but the hard backs are still a pertinent feature to keep us awake as we worship in silence for an hour. Another item of interest in this room are what we call the facing benches, which is where the elders of the meeting sat. Elders were those who were believed to have shown spiritual maturity. They weren't necessarily of old age, though since it was not a temporary assignment, they usually got there. Quakers have a reputation for living to old age. Because Quakers believe that truth is directly available to everybody and all have that of God within them, there are no clergy-laity divisions within the Society of Friends and no hierarchies. All decisions are made by all friends under the leading of divine truth. To do this, we have what we call a monthly meeting of worship for the conduct of business, which is why the local congregation is called a monthly meeting. And these are two examples of the clerk's benches. This is the older of the two benches, and it's made so that you don't always have to use it. And when you're doing just a plain meeting for worship, the benches are left clear and available. The newer table is down here, somewhat more egalitarian, because it's on the same level as the rest of us. It's currently decorated by modern friends with flowers, which would have scandalized friends of previous years who simply did not believe in such decorations or in bringing the outdoors inside. Actually, the meeting house was built in two stages. The first section, which went up in 1694, is the section that I'm sitting in now, and it extended only to the central beam with the notches in it, which shows where the original wall went. The congregation grew fairly fast, though, and in 1717, the building was more than doubled. It was extended out to the side, and a whole other room was built up, plus a second story went on. Now, at that point, it was really just a three-sided balcony that was constructed. At this particular pillar, you can see the notch, which indicates where the original three-sided gallery ran around the second story. In 1763, the balcony was filled in to form a complete second floor, and the first free school in New York was founded for those who could not afford to pay for their children's education. Now that's a good 100 years before free public schools, which, by the way, were also based on the Quaker free public schools. That's why in the New York area we have PS1, PS20, PS50, because that was how the Quakers named their schools, by numbers rather than after people. Like most meeting houses, this meeting house has the divisions between the male and the female sides. Women and men met separately for business, for meeting, and sat separately, though, together in one space for meeting, for worship. The panels in the walls are removable when large groups assemble, and we need the spaces on both sides. After the Revolution, a new floor was also put down, and in fact, in the original part of the building, there are 3 floors. In the newer part, there are 2 floors. All the floors, however, were always very cold, and so small benches to lift the feet off the cold floor were greatly appreciated, as one sat for at least an hour, or frequently much longer, in meetings for worship and meetings for business. You can still see some of the original hand-blown glass in the windows of the meeting house. In the 20th century, a side entrance plus restrooms were added to the old Quaker meeting house. This exterior view also shows the traditional shutters that were used to protect the windows when nobody was in the house or the weather was severe. I'm standing on the second floor against the north wind. You have to remember that when this meeting house was built in 1694, it was facing open territory, and the winds from the north would be fierce. So you needed to make sure that the north wall was particularly strong. And the way this was done in this building was through this bracing device known as ship's knees, because this was how ships were built as well. A ship's knee is made in a solid piece of wood from the trunk and the root of a tree. And it's as strong as can be. Here we are over 300 years later, and there's not so much as a crack in this. It has resisted over 300 years of terrible north winds wailing down from Canada.